Before we begin, I need to warn you. This case will make you question everything you think you know about law enforcement. Not just because of how Boston police officer John O'Keefe died on a snowy night in January 2022, but because of what happened after. What you're about to hear is a story that split an entire community down the middle. A story where nothing is what it seems. A story where the question isn't just who killed John O'Keefe, but whether the people investigating his death were telling the truth. If you're new to Crime Case Voices, this channel is dedicated to telling the stories of victims who deserve to be remembered and bringing awareness to cases that demand justice. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. And if the story affects you the way it affected me, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Now, let's get into what happened on that snowy night in January 2022. January 29th, 2022, 6 a.m., Canton, Massachusetts. A frantic 911 call comes in. A woman is screaming, hysterical. She says her boyfriend is lying in the snow outside a house. She says he's not moving. She says he's been out there all night during a blizzard. Emergency responders race to the scene. When they arrive at 34 Fairview Road, they find a man lying face up in the snow. He's wearing dark clothing, no coat. His body is covered in snow. His skin is pale, cold. Paramedics check for vital signs. There's a faint pulse, barely there. They rush him to Good Samaritan Medical Center in Brockton. But it's too late. At 7:50 a.m., 46-year-old John O'Keefe is pronounced dead. The woman who made the 911 call is 44-year-old Karen Reed. She and John had been dating for about 2 years. She tells police they'd been out drinking with friends the night before. She says she dropped him off at this house for an after-party. She says when she woke up and he wasn't there, she came back looking for him. And that's when she found him. But there's something she keeps saying, over and over, words that will haunt this case for years. I hit him. I hit him. Did I hit him? Those words. Did she mean them as a confession? Or was she asking a question? Because what happens next will divide an entire state. The prosecution will say Karen Reed killed her boyfriend, that she hit him with her SUV and left him to die in the snow during a blizzard. But the defense will say something entirely different. They'll say John O'Keefe was murdered inside that house. They'll say law enforcement officers killed him. And they'll say those same officers framed Karen Reed to cover it up. A conspiracy, evidence tampering, a cover-up involving cops, prosecutors, and a tainted investigation. 2 trials, hundreds of witnesses, years of legal battles, and the question that still haunts everyone: what really happened to John O'Keefe? But before we get into the investigation, the trials, and the shocking allegations, we need to understand who John O'Keefe was. Because this case isn't just about how he died. It's about who he was in life, and why his death shattered so many lives. John O'Keefe was born on December 8, 1975. He grew up in Massachusetts and joined the Boston Police Department, where he served for 16 years. He was a good cop, dedicated, respected, but what made John truly special wasn't his badge. It was what he did when his family needed him most. In 2013 and 2014, John's sister Kristen and her husband Stephen died within months of each other. They left behind 2 young children, a girl and a boy, orphans. Without hesitation, John stepped up. He took them in. He became their legal guardian. He raised them as his own. He drove them to school every morning. He went to parent-teacher conferences. He helped with homework. He made sure they had a stable, loving home after losing their parents. That's who John O'Keefe was, a man who showed up when it mattered most. By January 2022, John was in a relationship with Karen Reed. She was a financial analyst, smart, successful. They'd been together for about 2 years. Friends said they seemed happy, though like any couple, they had their ups and downs. On January 28, 2022, John spent the day with his niece and nephew. That evening, he and Karen made plans to go out with friends. They would visit 2 bars in Canton. They would drink. They would socialize. And by the end of the night, John O'Keefe would be dead. How he died, and who was responsible would become one of the most controversial cases Massachusetts has ever seen. Because when police started investigating, they found something. Evidence that pointed to Karen Red. But as the defense would later argue, that evidence might have been planted. The investigation might have been corrupt. And John O'Keefe might have been killed by the very people who were supposed to find his killer. February 1st, 2022. 3 days after John O'Keefe's death, the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office takes over the investigation. They assign Massachusetts State Police Trooper Michael Proctor as the lead investigator. Proctor is a 15-year veteran of the state police. He's been involved in numerous homicide investigations. He's considered experienced, capable, but what no one knows yet is that Proctor has a connection to this case that will later become a massive problem. He's friends with some of the people who were at the Albert house that night. He knows Brian Albert, the homeowner. They've socialized together. Their families know each other. This conflict of interest will not be disclosed for months. Proctor begins building a case against Karen Red. He interviews witnesses who were at the bars with Karen and John that night. He collects evidence from the scene. He examines Karen's vehicle. He pulls data from the vehicle's black box computer system. He reviews surveillance footage from the bars. He looks at cell phone records. And piece by piece, he builds a timeline. January 28, 2022. Around 10 p.m., Karen and John arrive at the Waterfall Bar and Grill in Canton. They meet up with friends. Brian Albert is there. So is Brian Higgins, a federal agent with the ATF. So is Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert's sister-in-law. They drink. They talk. They're having a good time. Around 11:30 p.m., the group decides to leave and head to C.F. McCarthy's, another bar nearby. At McCarthy's, they continue drinking. Karen and John are seen on surveillance footage. They look fine. No visible arguments. No drama. But according to witnesses, there's tension. Karen is drinking heavily. She's ordering drinks. John is trying to keep up with his friends. Around midnight, Brian Albert and some others decide to leave McCarthy's and head back to Albert's house at 34 Fairview Road for an after-party. Karen and John decide to go too. They get into Karen's black Lexus SUV. Karen is driving. John is in the passenger seat. They leave McCarthy's around 12:15 a.m. Surveillance footage shows them driving away. What happens next is where the stories diverge. According to the prosecution, Karen drives to 34 Fairview Road. She pulls up outside the house. John gets out of the car, but before he can walk to the front door, Karen backs up. She hits him with her vehicle. The impact is severe. It knocks him down. It fractures his skull. It breaks his arm. And then Karen drives away. She doesn't stop. She doesn't check on him. She leaves him lying in the snow during one of the worst blizzards Massachusetts has seen in years. The temperature drops below freezing. Snow accumulates. And John O'Keefe lies there, unconscious, dying, alone. Karen, according to this theory, goes home. She's drunk. She passes out. When she wakes up the next morning around 5 a.m., she realizes John never came home. She starts calling him. No answer. She starts texting him. No response. She calls Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert's sister-in-law. She asks if John stayed at the Albert house. Jennifer says no. She says John never came inside. Karen panics. She drives back to 34 Fairview Road, and that's when she sees him, lying in the snow, not moving. She starts screaming. She calls 911, and when police and paramedics arrive, she keeps saying, "I hit him. I hit him. Did I hit him?" The prosecution takes those words as a confession. Karen Reed admitting she hit John with her car. They use it as the foundation of their case. They charge Karen with 3 crimes: second-degree murder, manslaughter while operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol, and leaving the scene of a collision causing injury or death. If convicted, Karen faces life in prison. The evidence seems strong. Karen's own words, the damaged taillight, the plastic fragments found at the scene, data from her vehicle, data from John's phone, witnesses who say Karen and John were fighting that night. It looks like an open and shut case. But Karen Reed says she didn't do it. She says she dropped John off at the house. She says she saw him go inside. She says she drove home. And she says when she came back the next morning and found him in the snow, she was in shock. She was confused. She didn't know what happened. And that's why she kept saying, "Did I hit him?" Not as a confession, but as a question. A desperate, confused question from someone trying to make sense of a nightmare. And then Karen Reed hires Alan Jackson. And Jackson starts investigating. And what he finds will change everything. Because Jackson doesn't believe John O'Keefe was hit by a car. He believes John O'Keefe was killed inside that house. He believes law enforcement officers at the party attacked John, beat him, and then dragged his body outside and left him in the snow. And then they framed Karen Reed for murder. They planted evidence. They tampered with the investigation. They covered it up. And Jackson says he can prove it. March 2022. Karen Reed's defense team begins their investigation. They hire experts, accident reconstructionists, medical examiners, digital forensics specialists. They start looking at the evidence the prosecution collected. And they start finding problems. Big problems. Problems that, according to the defense, point to one conclusion. This was a frame job. The first issue the defense identifies is John O'Keefe's injuries. The prosecution says John was hit by Karen's SUV while it was backing up at approximately 24 miles per hour. The impact, they say, caused John's skull fracture and arm injuries. But the defense hires a biomechanics expert named Dr. Andrew Rentschler. He reviews the autopsy report. He examines photos of John's injuries. He conducts tests using crash test dummies and vehicles. And his conclusion is stunning. John O'Keefe's injuries are not consistent with being hit by a vehicle. Dr. Rentschler testifies that if John had been struck by Karen's SUV backing up at 24 miles per hour, his injuries would look completely different. There would be bruising on his arm where the taillight made contact. There would be fractures to his hand if he was holding a drinking glass at the time of impact. The glass would have shattered on impact. His arm would have been pushed away from his body with tremendous force. But none of that happened. John's arm showed scratches and abrasions, but no bruising. No fractures to his hand. The drinking glass was found intact near his body. And perhaps most importantly, John's arm injuries were on the back of his arm, not the front. If a car hit him from behind while backing up, the injuries would be on the front of his arm, not the back. So if John wasn't hit by a car, what happened to him? The defense has a theory. They believe John O'Keefe went inside the Albert house. They believe something happened inside that house. An altercation, a fight. They believe John was attacked, beaten, and then his body was dragged outside and left in the snow. And then the people inside the house, many of whom were law enforcement officers, conspired to frame Karen Reed for his death. It sounds far-fetched. Sounds like something out of a movie, but the defense says they have evidence to support it. They point to John's arm injuries. They say the scratches and abrasions on his arm are consistent with a dog attack. And guess who owned a dog? Brian Albert. He had a German Shepherd, a large, aggressive dog. The defense suggests that John was attacked by the dog inside the house, and that's how he got the injuries on his arm. The prosecution denies this. They say there's no evidence of dog DNA on John's clothing. But the defense argues that the lack of dog DNA doesn't prove anything, because the testing was incomplete. They also point to John's skull fracture. The fracture is on the back of his head. The defense argues this is consistent with John falling backward and hitting his head on something hard, like a floor or steps, not consistent with being hit by a car. The defense also raises questions about the investigation itself. They point out that Trooper Michael Proctor, the lead investigator, had a conflict of interest. He was friends with Brian Albert. He knew people who were at the party. He should have recused himself from the case. But he didn't. And then, during the first trial, something explosive came out. Text messages. Sent by Trooper Proctor. Text messages where he mocked Karen Reed, called her vile names, made crude jokes about her. Sent to friends and family while he was supposed to be conducting an impartial investigation. The text messages were read in court. They were shocking, disgusting, unprofessional, and they raised serious questions about whether Proctor had targeted Karen Red from the beginning. One of the most damning pieces of evidence the defense presents involves a Google search. Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert's sister-in-law, was at the Albert house that night. The next morning, she helped Karen search for John. And according to digital forensics experts, Jennifer McCabe searched Google at 2:27 a.m. on January 29, 2022, hours before John's body was found. The search query was, "How long does it take to die in the cold?" The defense argues this proves Jennifer McCabe knew John was outside dying in the snow hours before anyone supposedly found him. The prosecution argues the Google search was actually conducted at 6:24 a.m. after John's body was discovered, due to a timestamp error in the phone's browser. Two experts testified for the prosecution that the search was made in a browser that had been opened at 2:27 a.m., but the actual search happened later. The defense disputes this and continues to argue the search was made at 2:27 a.m. And then there's the taillight. The prosecution says Karen's damaged taillight proves she hit John. But the defense argues the taillight was tampered with after police seized Karen's vehicle. They point to testimony from Sergeant Nicholas Barros, a police officer who responded to Karen's parents' home in Dighton to help seize the vehicle. In his report, Barros noted there was damage to the taillight, but on the stand, he described it as relatively minor. There was a piece missing, but it was not completely damaged, he said. The defense suggests that after the vehicle was in police custody, someone smashed the taillight more severely and planted the pieces at the scene to make it look like Karen hit John. It's a wild theory, a massive conspiracy involving multiple law enforcement officers, evidence tampering, a cover-up. But the defense says it's the only explanation that fits the evidence. And as the case moves toward trial, the community becomes divided. Some people believe Karen Red is guilty. They believe she hit John with her car and left him to die. Others believe she's being framed. They believe there's a cover-up. They show up at court hearings wearing pink, Karen's signature color. They hold signs. They chant. They demand justice. The case becomes a media sensation, and Karen Red becomes a symbol. To some, she's a murderer. To others, she's a victim of corrupt law enforcement. April 16, 2024. More than 2 years after John O'Keefe's death, Karen Reed's first trial begins at Norfolk Superior Court in Dedham, Massachusetts. The courtroom is packed. Media, John's family, Karen's supporters. Everyone wants to see what happens. Judge Beverly Cannoni presides over the trial. The prosecution is led by Assistant District Attorney Adam Lally. The defense is led by Alan Jackson and his team, including Attorney David Yannetti. And for the next 9 weeks, the jury will hear testimony from dozens of witnesses. They will see hundreds of pieces of evidence, and they will have to decide, did Karen Reed kill John O'Keefe? The prosecution presents their case first. They call witnesses who were at the bars with Karen and John that night. They testify about the drinking, the atmosphere. Some say Karen and John seemed fine. Others say there was tension. They call Jennifer McCabe, who testifies about the events of that night and the next morning. They call Brian Albert's family members. They present data from Karen's SUV showing she backed up at the location where John's body was found. They present data from John's phone showing he stopped moving at 12:32 a.m. They show the jury photos of Karen's damaged taillight. They show the plastic fragments found at the scene. They bring in a medical examiner who testifies that John's injuries are consistent with being struck by a vehicle. But the defense fights back. They call their own experts. Dr. Rentschler, the biomechanics expert, testifies that John's injuries are not consistent with a vehicle strike. They present testimony questioning the investigation. They bring up Trooper Proctor's text messages. The jury hears the messages. They're shocked. Trooper Proctor had texted friends calling Karen a whack job and a C******. He made jokes about searching her home and not finding anything, except for a purple vibrator and some butt plugs. The messages are read aloud in court. The jury sees them, and the defense argues this proves the investigation was biased from the start. The defense also presents testimony about the Google search. They argue Jennifer McCabe searched. How long does it take to die in the cold? At 2:27 a.m., hours before John was found. The prosecution brings their own experts to dispute this, arguing the search happened later. But the seed of doubt has been planted. The defense raises questions about Brian Albert's dog. They suggest the dog attacked John. The prosecution denies this. They say there's no evidence. But again, doubt creeps in. And throughout the trial, Karen Reed does not take the stand. She doesn't testify, but the prosecution plays clips from media interviews she gave. They use her own words against her. They try to show inconsistencies in her story. After 9 weeks of testimony, the case goes to the jury. They deliberate for days. And then, on July 1st, 2024, they return. But they don't have a verdict. They're deadlocked. They can't reach a unanimous decision. The jury is hung. Judge Cannoni declares a mistrial. Karen Reed will not be convicted, but she will not be acquitted either. The case ends in limbo, but something else happens. After the mistrial, information leaks out. According to reports, some jurors later said they had actually reached a decision on some of the charges. They said they voted unanimously to acquit Karen on the charges of second-degree murder and leaving the scene. They were only deadlocked on the manslaughter charge. Karen's defense team immediately files motions arguing that she cannot be retried on the charges the jury agreed to acquit her on. That would be double jeopardy. But the prosecution disputes this. They say there was no official verdict, no acquittal. They say they can retry Karen on all charges. The legal battle continues for months. Karen's team appeals all the way to the Supreme Court, but they lose. The retrial is ordered. And in April 2025, it begins. This case gets even more shocking from here. The retrial is about to begin, and new evidence will come to light that will change everything. If you're finding this case as unbelievable as I am, hit that like button, share, subscribe, hit the notification, and drop a comment below telling me what you think. Was Karen Reed framed? Or did she kill John O'Keefe? Let's get into the retrial and see what happens. April 1st, 2025. Nearly a year after the mistrial. Jury selection begins for Karen Reed's second trial. Once again, it's at Norfolk Superior Court in Dedham. Judge Beverly Cannoni is still presiding. But this time, there's a new prosecutor. The Norfolk District Attorney's Office appoints Hank Brennan, a high-powered defense attorney-turned-special prosecutor, to handle the case. Brennan is known for being aggressive, strategic, effective, and he's determined to get a conviction this time. On the defense side, Karen Reed's team has grown. Alan Jackson is still the lead attorney. David Yannetti is still there. But they've added Robert Alessi, a New York defense attorney, to the team. Karen also does something unusual. She adds one of the alternate jurors from her first trial to her legal team. Someone who sat through the entire first trial and knows the case inside and out. April 22nd, 2025. The retrial officially begins. Opening statements. Prosecutor Hank Brennan stands before the jury and lays out the state's case. He tells them Karen Reed was drunk. She was driving. She hit John O'Keefe with her car, and she left him to die. He says the evidence is overwhelming. The damaged taillight, the plastic fragments, the data from her SUV, the data from John's phone, John's injuries. He says Karen's own words, "I hit him," are a confession. He tells the jury that John O'Keefe was a good man, a dedicated police officer, a loving guardian to his niece and nephew, and he deserves justice. Then Alan Jackson stands up. He looks at the jury, and he says something that sets the tone for the entire trial. This case was corrupted from the start. He tells the jury about Trooper Proctor's bias, about the conflicts of interest, about the evidence that doesn't add up. He says John O'Keefe was not hit by a car. He says John went inside the Albert house, and something happened inside that house that led to his death. He doesn't explicitly say who killed John. He doesn't present a third-party culprit defense, but he raises enough questions to create reasonable doubt. He tells the jury their job is not to figure out what happened to John O'Keefe. Their job is to decide whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Karen Reed killed him. and Jackson says they haven't. For the next 8 weeks, the trial unfolds. The prosecution calls 38 witnesses, law enforcement officers, medical examiners, forensic experts, friends who were with Karen and John that night. They present their evidence systematically. They try to build an airtight case. But the defense is ready. They cross-examine every witness. They challenge every piece of evidence. They call their own experts. And once again, the trial becomes a battle between two completely different versions of events. One of the most dramatic moments comes when the prosecution calls Massachusetts State Police Sergeant Yuri Buchanan to testify. Buchanan supervised Trooper Michael Proctor during the investigation. The defense uses Buchanan to present Proctor's text messages to the jury again. The messages are just as shocking the second time. Buchanan is asked whether Proctor's texts showed integrity and honor. He refuses to call Proctor the lead investigator, referring to him only as the case officer. And when pressed by Jackson, Buchanan admits the texts lacked integrity and honor. That text message does not show integrity, he says. That text message does not show honor. It's a damning admission, and it reinforces the defense's argument that the investigation was tainted from the beginning. Notably, some witnesses from the first trial do not testify in the retrial. Trooper Michael Proctor, despite being central to the case, is not called by either side. Brian Albert, the homeowner where John's body was found, does not testify. Brian Higgins, the ATF agent who was at the party, does not testify. Their absence is conspicuous. The defense uses it to suggest there's something being hidden. The prosecution argues these witnesses aren't necessary because they've presented enough evidence without them. But the jury notices. People notice. The defense calls Dr. Rentschler again. He testifies about John's injuries. He shows the jury videos of crash tests. He explains why John's injuries don't match a vehicle strike. The prosecution tries to discredit him. They bring their own experts. But Dr. Rentschler stands firm. He's confident. He's credible, and the jury listens. The defense also presents testimony about the taillight. They argue it was tampered with. They show discrepancies in how the taillight was described immediately after the vehicle was seized versus how it looked later. They suggest pieces were planted at the scene. The prosecution denies this vehemently, but the doubt is there. And once again, Karen Reed does not testify. She tells reporters outside the courtroom, "I am not testifying. They've heard my interview clips. They've heard my voice. They've heard a lot of me." The prosecution plays those interview clips. They try to use her words against her. But Karen stays off the stand. She doesn't give the prosecution a chance to cross-examine her. It's a strategic decision, and it might save her life. June 13th, 2025. After nearly 8 weeks of testimony, closing arguments begin. Prosecutor Hank Brennan goes first. He holds up a photo of John O'Keefe. He reminds the jury who the victim is. A 46-year-old police officer. A father figure to 2 young children who lost their parents. A man who dedicated his life to serving his community. And he says Karen Reed took that life away. Brennan walks the jury through the evidence. The data from Karen's SUV showing she backed up. The data from John's phone showing he stopped moving at 12:32 a.m. The damaged taillight. The plastic fragments. John's injuries. He says all of it points to one conclusion. Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe with her car and left him to die. Brennan addresses the defense's conspiracy theory head-on. He calls it absurd. He says there's no evidence of a cover-up. He says the defense is trying to distract the jury from the facts. He says, she was drunk, she hit him, and she left him to die. He asks the jury to find Karen Reed guilty, to give John O'Keefe and his family justice. Then Alan Jackson stands up for his closing argument. He doesn't hold back. He tells the jury, this case was corrupted from the start. It was corrupted by biases and conflicts and personal loyalties that you heard about. And most fatally, it was corrupted by a lead investigator whose misconduct infected every single part of this case from the top to the bottom. He talks about Trooper Proctor's text messages. He talks about the conflicts of interest. He talks about the evidence that doesn't make sense. He tells the jury they don't have to figure out what happened to John O'Keefe. They just have to decide whether the prosecution proved their case. And Jackson says they didn't. Jackson reminds the jury of Dr. Rentschler's testimony. John's injuries don't match a vehicle strike. He reminds them of the taillight evidence and the questions about tampering. He reminds them of the Google search. He says there are too many unanswered questions, too many problems with the investigation, too much reasonable doubt. He asks the jury to find Karen Reed not guilty. The jury begins deliberating on the afternoon of June 13th. They deliberate for hours, then days. The courthouse is surrounded by Karen's supporters. Hundreds of people wearing pink, holding signs, chanting. The case has become a phenomenon, a movement. People who believe Karen is being framed by corrupt cops. People who believe this case represents everything wrong with law enforcement. But inside the courtroom, John O'Keefe's family sits quietly, waiting, hoping for justice for John. June 18, 2025, day 4 of deliberations. At 3 p.m., there's a knock on the jury room door. They have a verdict. Everyone files back into the courtroom. Karen Reed sits at the defense table. Her hands are shaking. Her attorneys sit beside her. John's family sits in the gallery. The tension is unbearable. Judge Cannoni asks the jury foreperson if they've reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The verdict form is handed to the judge. She reads it silently, then hands it to the court clerk to read aloud. In the case of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Karen Reed, on the charge of second-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant, Karen Reed, not guilty. The courtroom erupts. Karen collapses into Alan Jackson's arms. She's sobbing. Her attorneys are hugging her. Outside, the crowd goes wild. Screaming, cheering. Pink confetti cannons go off. On the charge of manslaughter while operating a vehicle under the influence, we the jury find the defendant, Karen Reed, not guilty. More cheers. More tears. On the charge of leaving the scene of a collision causing injury or death, we the jury find the defendant, Karen Reed, not guilty. Karen Reed has been acquitted of murder, acquitted of manslaughter, acquitted of leaving the scene. But there's one more charge. On the charge of operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol, we the jury find the defendant, Karen Reed, guilty. Karen is convicted of drunk driving, a misdemeanor. Judge Cannoni sentences her immediately. 1 year probation, the standard sentence for a first-time DUI offense. Karen must complete a driver alcohol education program. Her license is suspended for 90 days. But she's free. She's not going to prison. She walks out of the courthouse a free woman. Karen Reed has been acquitted. But the story isn't over. What really happened to John O'Keefe? Was there a cover-up? Or was the prosecution's case just too weak? Before we get into the aftermath, let me know in the comments. Do you think Karen Reed was framed? And what case should I cover next? Let's keep going. Like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell. June 18th, 2025. Outside Norfolk Superior Court. Karen Reed descends the courthouse steps. She's surrounded by her legal team, and waiting for her is a sea of supporters. Hundreds of people, maybe 1,000. They're screaming her name, cheering, crying, firing pink confetti cannons. Karen waves. She's crying. She's in shock. She can't believe it's over. She stops to speak to reporters. "Thank you to everyone who supported me," she says. "Thank you to my incredible legal team. And thank you to the jury for seeing the truth." She's asked if she has anything to say to John O'Keefe's family. She pauses. "No one has fought harder for justice for John O'Keefe than I have and my team." It's a controversial statement, one that will anger John's family. Inside the courthouse, John O'Keefe's family is devastated. They don't speak to reporters. They leave quietly through a back entrance. But later, they release a statement. It's signed by members of the Albert and McCabe families, the families connected to the house where John's body was found. "Today, our hearts are with John and the entire O'Keefe family," the statement reads. "They have suffered through so much and deserved better from our justice system. This is a devastating miscarriage of justice. The statement doesn't mention Karen by name, but the message is clear. They believe she's guilty. They believe she got away with murder. The case divides Massachusetts even further. Some people celebrate Karen's acquittal. They see it as a victory against corrupt law enforcement, a victory for justice. They point to Trooper Proctor's text messages, the conflicts of interest, the problems with the investigation. They say the case was tainted from the start. They say Karen was framed, and they demand accountability. They want Trooper Proctor held responsible. They want the officers who were at the Albert House that night to be investigated. They want answers. Others are furious about the verdict. They believe Karen killed John. They believe she got away with it because her high-powered legal team created enough reasonable doubt. They point to the evidence, the damaged taillight, the data from her SUV, John's injuries. They say the conspiracy theory is nonsense. They say the defense created a smokescreen. And they say Karen Red is a murderer who will never face justice. The community is split down the middle. Friends have stopped speaking to each other. Families are divided. It's become about more than just this case. It's become a symbol of something bigger. Trust in law enforcement, faith in the justice system, the search for truth in a world where truth feels increasingly elusive. In the weeks following the verdict, there are consequences for some of the people involved in the investigation. Trooper Michael Proctor, who sent those vile text messages about Karen Red, faces discipline. He was suspended without pay shortly after the messages were revealed during the first trial. In March 2025, just weeks before the retrial began, Proctor was dishonorably discharged from the Massachusetts State Police after a trial board found him guilty of unsatisfactory performance and conduct unbecoming an officer. His attorney says they're appealing the decision. But for now, Proctor's career in law enforcement is over. His text messages destroyed him, and the defense argues those text messages destroyed the entire case against Karen Red. Another consequence: Kelly Dever, a Boston police officer who was questioned during the retrial, resigns in September 2025. Her testimony was tense. She was asked about her connections to people involved in the case. She was asked about her knowledge of what happened that night. And apparently the pressure became too much. She resigns. No explanation given. Just another person whose life was upended by this case. And then there's the federal investigation. During the retrial, Prosecutor Hank Brennan revealed in court that the FBI had been investigating the case, investigating whether there was any truth to the defense's allegations of a cover-up, investigating whether law enforcement officers tampered with evidence or conspired to frame Karen Reed. The investigation lasted for months. And then, in March 2025, Brennan announced in court that the federal investigation was closed. No charges were filed. No evidence of criminal wrongdoing by law enforcement was found. The defense was furious. Alan Jackson said in a radio interview that he'd never heard of an investigative agency announcing to the target that the investigation is closed. He suggested the investigation wasn't thorough enough. That questions remain unanswered. But officially, the federal government found no evidence of a conspiracy. So what really happened to John O'Keefe? That question remains unanswered. Karen Reed says she didn't kill him. The jury acquitted her. But they convicted her of drunk driving, which means they believed she was driving that night. So if she didn't hit John with her car, what happened? The defense suggested John was attacked inside the Albert House. But they never proved it. They never presented a third-party culprit. They just raised questions, created doubt. And in the American justice system, reasonable doubt is enough to acquit. Some people believe John O'Keefe died in an accident, that Karen did hit him with her car, but it was truly an accident, that she was drunk, she made a terrible mistake, and she's been living with the guilt ever since. Others believe the defense's theory, that John was killed inside the house, that there was a fight, maybe an altercation with the dog, maybe something worse, and that the people inside panicked and covered it up. And still others believe something in between, that maybe John went inside the house, something happened, and he ended up outside in the snow. But not because Karen hit him, because someone else put him there. Let's break down the key pieces of evidence in this case and what they actually prove or don't prove, because that's what makes this case so fascinating and so frustrating. Almost every piece of evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways, starting with Karen's damaged taillight. The prosecution says the taillight was damaged when Karen backed into John. They found plastic fragments at the scene that matched her taillight. Case closed, right? Not so fast. The defense argues the taillight damage was minor when police first seized the vehicle. Sergeant Nicholas Barros testified that when he helped seize Karen's SUV at her parents' house in Dighton, he noted damage to the taillight in his report. But on the stand, he said it was relatively minor. The piece was missing, but the taillight wasn't completely destroyed. The defense suggests that after the vehicle was in police custody, someone smashed the taillight more severely. They suggest the plastic fragments found at the scene were planted there to frame Karen. Is that possible? Technically, yes. Is it likely? That's for you to decide. The prosecution says the timeline makes it impossible. The Massachusetts CERT team, the state's emergency response team, arrived at the scene late in the afternoon on January 29th, hours after John's body was found. They formed a grid line and sifted through the snow near where John's body had been. They found the taillight pieces, the cocktail glass John had taken from Karen's car, John's shoe. The prosecution says police had just gotten custody of Karen's car at that point. There's no way they could have already planted evidence. But the defense argues the timeline is murky. They argue there was time for tampering. Next, John O'Keefe's injuries. This is where things get really complicated. The prosecution's medical examiner testified that John's injuries were consistent with being struck by a vehicle. He had a fractured skull. He had injuries to his arm. He had abrasions and contusions. The medical examiner said these injuries could have been caused by a vehicle impact followed by a fall to the ground. But the defense's biomechanics expert, Dr. Andrew Rentschler, completely disagreed. He testified that if John had been hit by Karen's SUV backing up at 24 miles per hour, his injuries would look completely different. He conducted tests using crash test dummies and vehicles. He showed videos of these tests to the jury. In the tests, when a dummy was struck by a vehicle backing up at 24 miles per hour, the arm was pushed away from the body with tremendous force. The taillight shattered on impact. Debris flew forward with the vehicle. The arm showed clear impact marks, bruising, possible fractures. But John O'Keefe's injuries didn't match that pattern. His arm had scratches and abrasions, but no bruising where the taillight would have struck him. No fractures to his hand, even though he was supposedly holding a glass at the time of impact. The glass was found intact near his body, not shattered on impact. And perhaps most tellingly, John's arm injuries were on the back of his arm, not the front. If a car hit him from behind while backing up, the injuries should be on the front of his arm, not the back. Dr. Rentschler testified, "There was no trauma. There were no fractures. There wasn't even an indication on the arm of where it would have contacted the vehicle. There was no bruising. There were no lacerations. There was nothing at the alleged point of contact which would indicate an impact that produces thousands of pounds of force. So if John wasn't hit by a car, what caused his injuries? The defense suggests a dog attack could explain the scratches and abrasions on his arm. Brian Albert owned a German Shepherd. But the prosecution says there's no evidence of dog DNA on John's clothing. The defense argues the DNA testing was incomplete. They say the absence of dog DNA doesn't prove there wasn't a dog attack. It's a stalemate. Neither side can definitively prove their theory. The defense also suggests John's skull fracture could have been caused by a fall. If John fell backward and hit his head on something hard like concrete steps or a floor, it could cause the type of skull fracture he had. But again, there's no proof. Then there's the data from Karen's SUV. The vehicle's black box computer system recorded data about the vehicle's movements. That data shows that at the location where John's body was found, Karen's SUV was put in reverse and the accelerator was pressed to approximately 75% throttle. The prosecution says this proves Karen backed up and hit John. The defense doesn't dispute the data, but they argue it doesn't prove Karen hit John. They say Karen could have backed up for any number of reasons. Maybe she was adjusting her position. Maybe she was trying to park. The data shows she backed up. It doesn't show she hit anything or anyone. The data from John O'Keefe's phone is another key piece of evidence. His iPhone's health app tracked his steps. According to the data, John stopped moving at 12:32 a.m. on January 29, 2022. The prosecution says this is the moment Karen hit him. The defense argues it could just mean John stopped walking. Maybe he went inside the house and sat down. Maybe he was attacked and couldn't move. The phone data proves John stopped moving. It doesn't prove how or why. And then there's the Google search. This might be the most controversial piece of evidence in the entire case. According to the defense's digital forensics experts, Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert's sister-in-law, searched Google at 2:27 a.m. on January 29, 2022. The search query was, "How long does it take to die in the cold?" This was hours before John's body was supposedly found at 6 a.m. The defense argues this proves Jennifer McCabe knew John was outside dying in the snow hours before anyone claims to have found him. It suggests she had knowledge of what happened to John. It suggests a cover-up. But the prosecution brought two experts who testified that the Google search was not conducted at 2:27 a.m. They said the search was conducted at 6:24 a.m. after John's body was found. They explained that the Safari browser on Jennifer's phone had been opened at 2:27 a.m., but the actual search wasn't conducted until 6:24 a.m. The timestamp showing 2:27 a.m. was from when the browser was opened, not when the search was performed. The defense disputes this. They hired their own experts who say the search was at 2:27 a.m. It's dueling experts, dueling interpretations of digital data. And once again, the jury has to decide who to believe. The evidence in this case can be interpreted in so many different ways, and that's what makes it so controversial. Before we get to the final parts of the story, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and hit that like button if you're following along. Drop a comment and tell me, based on the evidence, do you think Karen Reed was guilty or innocent? Let's continue. June 2025. Karen Reed is acquitted of murder. She's free, but her legal battles aren't over, because John O'Keefe's family has filed a civil lawsuit against her. A wrongful death lawsuit seeking $50,000 in damages. The lawsuit was put on hold while the criminal trials played out. But now that the criminal case is resolved, the civil case can move forward. Karen's attorneys in the civil case declined to comment publicly. But the case is ongoing, and it could go to trial if a settlement isn't reached. In a civil trial, the burden of proof is different than in a criminal trial. In a criminal trial, the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very high bar. In a civil trial, the plaintiff only has to prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning it's more likely than not that the defendant is responsible. That's a much lower bar. So even though Karen was acquitted in the criminal trial, she could potentially be found liable in the civil trial. This happened before. O.J. Simpson was acquitted of murder in his criminal trial but found liable for wrongful death in his civil trial. Karen Reed's conviction for drunk driving complicates things. The jury found her guilty of operating a vehicle under the influence. So they believed she was driving that night. They believed she was drunk. That could be used against her in the civil trial. The O'Keefe family could argue that even if Karen didn't intentionally kill John, her drunk driving contributed to his death, and in a civil trial that might be enough to hold her liable. But Karen's defense team has options. They can argue the same things they argued in the criminal trial. That John wasn't hit by a car, that his injuries don't match a vehicle strike, that there are too many unanswered questions about what really happened, and they can point to the criminal trial acquittal as evidence that the case against Karen is weak. The civil case adds another layer of tragedy to this story. John O'Keefe's family just wants justice. They want accountability. They lost John. His niece and nephew lost their guardian. The man who stepped up to raise them after their parents died is gone, and they believe Karen Reed is responsible. Whether the civil case goes to trial or settles out of court remains to be seen. But it's a reminder that even when a criminal case ends, the pain and the legal battles can continue for years. In August 2025, Alan Jackson joins Karen Reed's legal team for the civil trial. Jackson, who led her criminal defense, is now representing her in the wrongful death lawsuit. Karen's attorneys also file motions to dismiss certain claims in the lawsuit, including an emotional distress claim. They argue the claims are legally insufficient. But as of now, the civil case is still pending, and the O'Keefe family is still fighting for what they believe is justice for John. Beyond the civil case, there are other consequences. Trooper Michael Proctor, the disgraced investigator, is trying to get his job back. In August 2025, he appears at a hearing in an effort to overturn his dishonorable discharge from the Massachusetts State Police. His attorney argues the punishment was too harsh, that Proctor's text messages, while inappropriate, didn't constitute misconduct serious enough to warrant termination. But the State Police Trial Board upholds the discharge. Proctor's career in law enforcement is over, and in a way, he's become a symbol of everything that went wrong in this case. Whether you believe Karen Reed is guilty or innocent, everyone agrees Proctor's behavior was unacceptable. His text messages destroyed his credibility, and they tainted the entire investigation. Kelly Dever, the Boston police officer who resigned in September 2025, remains a mystery. Why did she resign? What did she know about the case? What was she involved in? No one knows. She hasn't spoken publicly, but her resignation fuels speculation. The people who believe in the conspiracy theory see her resignation as evidence of guilt. Evidence that she was involved in something she didn't want to be questioned about further. The people who don't believe the conspiracy theory see it as just another casualty of a case that destroyed lives and careers. Either way, Kelly Dever is gone. Another person whose life was upended by what happened to John O'Keefe. And then there's Karen Reed herself. What does life look like for her now? She's free. She's not in prison. But she's convicted of drunk driving. She has a criminal record. She's on probation for a year. Her driver's license is suspended for 90 days. She has to complete a driver alcohol education program. And she's facing a civil lawsuit that could cost her $50,000 or more. She's also become a polarizing public figure. To some, she's a hero, a victim of corrupt law enforcement who fought back and won. To others, she's a villain, a murderer who got away with killing a good man. Karen has gained a massive following. Her supporters call themselves the Free Karen Red movement. They show up at her court hearings wearing pink. They raise money for her legal defense. They post about the case on social media constantly. Some people say Karen has become a cult hero, but Karen insists she's not interested in fame. She just wants her life back. She wants to move on. In August 2025, it's announced that Elizabeth Banks will reportedly play Karen Red in a limited series about the case. Hollywood is interested. The case is being turned into entertainment. And that's another layer of complexity. Because for John O'Keefe's family, this isn't entertainment. This is their life, their pain, their loss. And it's being turned into a TV show. It's being dissected by millions of people who have opinions but weren't there, who don't know what really happened, who are treating a real-life tragedy like a true crime podcast. And that's the world we live in now, where real cases become content, where real people become characters, where justice and entertainment become intertwined in ways that are uncomfortable and complicated. So what really happened to John O'Keefe? After 2 trials, hundreds of hours of testimony, and millions of dollars spent on legal fees, we still don't know for sure. The jury acquitted Karen Reed of murder, manslaughter, and leaving the scene. But that doesn't definitively answer the question. Did Karen hit John with her car and the prosecution simply couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? Or was John killed inside the Albert house and Karen was framed? Or is the truth somewhere in between? Let's look at what we know for certain. We know John O'Keefe died on January 29, 2022. We know his body was found in the snow outside 34 Fairview Road in Canton, Massachusetts. We know he had been out drinking with Karen Reed and friends the night before. We know Karen was driving her SUV that night. We know Karen's taillight was damaged. We know plastic fragments from a taillight were found near John's body. We know John had a fractured skull and arm injuries. We know he died from hypothermia and his injuries. Those are the facts everyone agrees on. Everything else is interpretation. Theory. Competing narratives. The prosecution's theory is straightforward. Karen was drunk. She drove to 34 Fairview Road. She dropped John off. But before he could go inside, she backed up and hit him with her car. The impact knocked him down. She panicked and drove away. John lay in the snow during a blizzard and died from his injuries and exposure to the cold. Karen woke up the next morning, realized what she'd done, and went back to find him. The defense's theory is more complex. Karen drove John to 34 Fairview Road. John got out of the car and went inside the house for the after-party. Something happened inside the house. Maybe John got into a fight with someone. Maybe Brian Albert's dog attacked him. Maybe there was an altercation that led to John getting hurt. Whatever happened, John ended up injured. The people inside the house panicked. They knew John was a cop. They knew some of them were cops. They knew if John was seriously hurt or dead, there would be an investigation. So they made a decision. They dragged John's body outside. They left him in the snow. They decided to make it look like an accident. And they decided to frame Karen Reed. They smashed her taillight and planted the pieces at the scene. They manipulated the investigation. They covered it up. Which theory is true? The jury said the prosecution didn't prove there's beyond a reasonable doubt. But that doesn't mean the defense's theory is true. It just means there was reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt is enough to acquit. So let's talk about the problems with both theories. The prosecution's theory has several issues. John's injuries don't clearly match a vehicle strike. Dr. Rentschler's testimony was compelling. The lack of bruising on John's arm where the taillight allegedly hit him. The lack of fractures to his hand. The intact glass. The injuries being on the back of his arm instead of the front. These are real problems. The prosecution tried to explain them, but their explanations weren't entirely satisfying. The investigation also had problems. Trooper Proctor's text messages were inexcusable. Whether or not they prove he framed Karen, they prove he was biased. They prove he wasn't conducting an impartial investigation. And that taints everything. The defense's theory also has problems. Where's the proof? Where's the evidence that John went inside the house? Where's the evidence that there was a fight or a dog attack? Where's the evidence of a cover-up? The defense raised questions. They created doubt. But they never proved their theory. They never identified who killed John. They never explained exactly what happened inside the house. They never proved the taillight was tampered with. They never proved the plastic pieces were planted. They suggested these things might have happened. But might isn't proof. And that's the frustrating thing about this case. Both theories have holes. Both theories require you to believe things that aren't fully supported by evidence. So what do we believe? Here's what I think. And this is just my opinion based on the facts. I think John O'Keefe's death was a tragedy. I think something happened that night that led to his death. I don't think we'll ever know exactly what that something was. I think the investigation was flawed. Trooper Proctor's bias was real. The conflicts of interest were real. Whether that means there was an actual cover-up, I don't know. But I think the investigation was compromised enough that we can't trust all the evidence. I think Karen Reed was drunk that night. The jury convicted her of drunk driving. So she was definitely driving under the influence. I think it's possible she hit John with her car. I think it's also possible she didn't. I think the evidence is genuinely unclear. And I think that's why the jury acquitted her. Not necessarily because they believed she was innocent, but because they had reasonable doubt. What I don't think is that there was a massive conspiracy involving multiple law enforcement officers planting evidence and covering up a murder. That's possible, but it requires believing a lot of things that aren't proven. It requires believing a lot of people were willing to commit serious crimes to frame Karen Reed. And while I think some aspects of the investigation were problematic, I don't know if I believe it went that far. But I could be wrong. That's the thing about this case. We could all be wrong. Because we weren't there. We don't know what really happened. And the people who were there aren't telling us the truth. Either because they're covering something up, or because they genuinely don't know, or because they're too traumatized to remember clearly. What we do know is that John O'Keefe is dead. And that's the real tragedy here. John O'Keefe was a good man. He served his community for 16 years as a Boston police officer. But more importantly, he was a good uncle. When his sister and brother-in-law died, John didn't hesitate. He took in their 2 young children. He became their guardian. He raised them. He loved them. He showed up to their school events. He helped with homework. He made sure they had a stable, loving home after losing their parents. That's who John O'Keefe was. A man who stepped up when it mattered most. John O'Keefe's niece and nephew are still without him. They lost their parents. Then they lost their uncle. The man who promised to take care of them. The man who loved them like they were his own children. John's mother, his siblings, his extended family, they're all still grieving. They're still searching for answers. They're still trying to make sense of what happened. And they deserve those answers. John deserves justice. Whether that justice is holding Karen Reed accountable, or uncovering what really happened inside that house, or simply acknowledging that John's life mattered and his death was a tragedy, he deserves something. He deserves to be remembered as more than just a victim in a controversial case. He deserves to be remembered as Officer John O'Keefe. Guardian, uncle, son, brother, friend, a man who served his community, a man who loved his family, a man who did the right thing when it mattered most. Rest in peace, John O'Keefe. You deserved better than this. Your family deserves better than this. And we hope, someday, they get the answers and the peace they're searching for. That was one of the most controversial cases in recent history. If this story impacted you, hit that like button, share, subscribe to this channel, and hit notification for more deep dives into shocking true crime cases. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Was Karen Reed framed? Or did she get away with murder? What really happened to John O'Keefe? And what case should I cover next? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.